Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 247. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about glaciers and salt flats and bus rides as we go to Chile. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before I get into this week's interview, I do have one news item of a personal nature for anyone who is a listener to the show. The question that I raised last week is, given my new job with TripAdvisor as a director of engineering, would I in fact be still doing the show? We worked out an agreement in terms of conflict of interest, and I will be allowed to do both the blog and the podcast. I will be making it non-commercial, so I'll be taking all the ads off, but that's not so much of an issue for me. And the biggest issue is going to be time, and really we're going to have to wait and see, because obviously the job does have to come first, because I'm very excited about the job, and obviously it's a wonderful opportunity. So hopefully you can bear with me as we try and figure out schedules and whether this will still come out every week or not, and I can't really say at this time. I will say that since this is the last episode that will include sponsorships, at least for the foreseeable future, this is a great time to give one last plug for the Egypt photo tour, again in November. And you can check that out at amateurtraveler.com/tours. And then also, since I won't be doing commercial placements on the podcast starting with the next show, if you're interested in doing a tour on Globus, again, you can save 10%, and I'll be taking down those links from the site, so you might want to check that out. That's amateurtraveler.com/Globus. Because I am planning on continuing the show to the extent that I have the time, and because I'm going to be in Boston quite a lot this fall, because TripAdvisor is in Boston, I'm interested in doing a Boston meetup. And so if you go to the Facebook page at facebook.com/amateurtraveler, I'll be coordinating a time on that site. I'd like to welcome to the show Jodi Ettenberg, who comes to us from legalnomads.com, which is her site. Jodi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
And Jodi is one of my new favorite people, having met at TBEX this summer. And Jodi's come to talk to us about Chile. Why did you go to Chile? What led you down there?
Chile was actually, or South America was the first stop on my around the world trip. I used to work in South America back in 2001 and 2002. So I really missed it. I had taught myself Spanish when I was there, and it seemed like a fun way to jump into this trip would be going somewhere where I already knew I spoke the language. The other thing is that I really do love mountain climbing and trekking, and I ended up quitting my job in March and leaving at the beginning of April. So I shot all the way down to the tip of South America into Chile and Patagonia to start the trip so that I could do so and do some trekking before it got too cold, because April, as I learned, was pushing it a bit in terms of the weather.
And we mostly want to talk about your travels, but I do have to ask, since your site is Legal Nomads, we should tell people that you are an ex-lawyer. The job you quit was being a lawyer, which, as I understand, you really only became a lawyer on a dare.
That is true. I have the benefit of being from Quebec and going to law school there, and tuition is extraordinarily reasonable, especially if you're a Quebec resident. And I actually did not go to do an undergraduate degree. I skipped it, and that was the bet, in fact, that someone bet me I couldn't get in because they were taking a few people and putting them with everyone else who had done an undergraduate into one sort of bad science experiment of a pot. And when I got in, I figured, it'd be a big act of hubris not to go. So why not? So I went.
Getting back to Chile.
Yes.
So you started in Patagonia, so you're at the very southern tip of Chile.
Right. What happened was I flew down to Punta Arenas originally and went from there by bus to Puerto Natales and basically wanted to get straight into Torres del Paine before it got too cold. Now, Torres del Paine is really beautiful. You can take anywhere from a huge, they call it the W, it's a 60-mile trek through the full park, or you can do sort of day tours or smaller tours. And it really is just a wondrous place to be. It's a difficult trek, and for us it was extraordinarily cold, but the glaciers, these huge granite towers, and these extraordinarily strong winds, you really feel like you're in the middle of a different planet. And that was a really ideal way to start the trip because it sort of threw me into things head first.
My picture of that region is that it's very well prepared for tourism by this point.
That's right. I think, especially coming into it, I had done some travel, but it was certainly not anywhere near the time when I left. It was quite a while ago. And there are many hostels, there are many hotels, there are tons of sort of tourist organizations that are set up to take you out to these national parks. And a lot of the country has been designated a natural park. What I found fascinating as well is if you look at the history of South America, and of course they had the tripartite war, they had so many border disputes and continue to have them. Patagonia especially, I remember being in Chile and someone was looking over at the Argentine side in our group who was Chilean and started waxing poetic, to put it nicely, about the Argentine people and the history and how half that land should have been Chile's. So it's always interesting to go to places like that as well, knowing the history is tumultuous and sort of you're lucky to be there yourself.
What surprised you about Chile?
I think for me, having spent time in South America before, it was in a much less desert-like place. I was in Corrientes in Argentina back in 2001, but mostly in Uruguay and mostly in Brazil and other parts of the continent that are extremely verdant. So for me, the shocking part about Chile was just how otherworldly the desert parts looked like, which is at the very north, so at the other end of the country from Chilean Patagonia. And I remember coming into Calama, which is this tiny little airport, and it's near the world's biggest copper mines, which is in Calama, and going into San Pedro de Atacama, and it really just looks like something almost lifeless and bizarre. These huge plains that stretch out in front of you, and really nothing as far as the eye can see but earth. And in the center of the states, there are national parks that are similar, but I'm from Montreal. It's not really any landscape that I was used to. And it looked so barren and really full of nothing but rock. I found it fascinating.
Anything else really stick with you in terms of a perception or an impression about Patagonia?
One of my favorite animals is the llama. It's full of alpacas and vicuñas and llamas. The wildlife is just superb. It's just one of those places that is so accessible and inaccessible at the same time. As soon as you start trekking through, there's a bay called Bahia Inutil, which really technically translates into the useless bay because it's so in the middle of nowhere that There's really no access to it at all. And it's really that unspeakable, fantastic experience of being in the middle of nature, coming from somewhere, especially so corporate from my end. But I've met so many people who've done shorter trips to South America, gone through Patagonia. You can connect from Santiago and take a flight straight down and really just disappear into nature immediately. And that's something really special.
Now, you say the llama is your favorite animal. As I recall from talking before we started recording here, that's to pet, not to eat.
Yes, it is known as a very healthy meat. It's low in fat, it's high in protein, much like the ostrich. I got terribly sick when I ate a llama empanada in San Pedro de Atacama, which rhymes beautifully. My brother actually accused me of karmic injustice because if I ate my favorite animal or one of them, of course, it would get me sick. And frankly, everyone else in my group that ate it did not get sick, so he may have something going there. We basically went from Patagonia and crisscrossed through Chilean and Argentine Patagonia. We went to Argentina to the glaciers and came back. And we went up to, I think it was 42 hours by bus from Patagonia to Santiago, stopping at a place called Osorno, which we called the armpit of Chile because there was nothing but a park where every youth in town appeared to be making out with his or her girlfriend or boyfriend.
You say that as if it were a bad thing, but...
It was Sunday. It was really like the pastime for Sunday, apparently. We felt left out. I really didn't know what to do in that town. And then we went north to Santiago to see a soccer game and then went all the way up to San Pedro de Atacama. Flying into Calama, Calama itself is a very interesting place because it was part of Bolivia for a while and Chile took it back in one of the border disputes. And a huge percentage of Chile's income and its exports are in copper. And what I found fascinating was to think about, of course, this is the case in many countries, but if Bolivia had kept Calama, how the geopolitics of that continent would be so different, because Bolivia, of course, is one of the poorest countries in South America. And San Pedro de Atacama was an exciting place, not just because I got the worst food poisoning of my life, but also because you can go on beautiful tours to Valle de la Luna. And I can actually send you a picture of some of that because that was part of that landscape that I found so surreal. And there's also a trip that I took into the middle of the desert. A French astronomer has set up these huge telescopes. And one of the highlights was you sit there as the moon comes up and the stars come out. And he goes through the constellations as they are interpreted by the Mayans, as they were interpreted by ancient civilizations, and then as they're now currently known. And for someone who is fascinated with astronomy, which I am, it was just a really special experience. And the stars in the middle of the Chilean desert were breathtaking. So I would highly recommend that people try that from San Pedro de Atacama.
Now, you talked about a 42-hour bus ride. Chile is a long, long, thin country, and you actually got to almost all of the length of that. How long is it off the top of your head?
I actually don't know the length of the country.
I want to say it's about 2,000 miles or something, but I don't know if I'm exaggerating.
It is an extraordinarily long country, there's no question. I did fly from Santiago up to Calama, and ironically, I bought a return ticket, but it cost less than buying a one-way, so I just never took the return. That part of it, I definitely skipped over, but just getting from Patagonia all the way up to Santiago, it takes a long time. The buses in South America, as you likely know, are just really beautiful. They run them like planes. You get a flight attendant. They introduce what they call the pilot. You get your meals. They play bingo. They do. They play bingo. And word to the wise, bingo in South America is not one line. It's the whole card.
Okay.
So I called bingo on one of these bus rides and everyone screamed at me because I only had one line. I ended up actually winning the whole card anyhow, and I won a return bus ticket anywhere in Chile, which I gave to the oldest man on the bus. But I now know that in South America, or at least in Chile and Argentina, bingo is the whole card.
And it looks like the answer to my question is that Chile is between 2,600 and 2,700 miles long or high and never more than 110 or 120 miles wide.
Right. It really is an incredible sliver of land that just stretches all the way down. And as places go to start the trip, it is a lot less rugged in its personality than a place like Bolivia. So for people who are looking to go to South America and sort of dip their feet in, a lot of people do go to Argentina. Chile is an excellent alternative. They also have an incredibly beautiful Patagonia and that desert landscape, but it's not as touristed, at least I found, than parts of Argentina were.
Okay. Did you want to talk any more about your itinerary or a recommended itinerary?
We went from the top into Bolivia and did a trip through Salar de Uyuni, which I would definitely recommend. I mean, minus the fact that I was throwing up for most of it. It was incredibly beautiful, and you can cross into Bolivia at this tiny little border and then spread out through this huge salt flats, the biggest salt flats in the world, and you finally get to Uyuni and you can take a bus to La Paz. If people don't want to go into Bolivia, there are many other options in the north near Salar. There is Salar de Atacama, and Salar is a salt lake. So there's the Atacama version of that. There's a Chaxa Lagoon, which has similar wildlife. There's tons of flamingos in a lot of these different lagoons, both on the Bolivian and the Chilean side. So there's a series of different lagoons in the north, and there's some geysers as well, all of which are set against this barren landscape where llamas roam free. It really is just beautiful to see. There's a triangle of activity that you can access from the north of Chile, and if you fly LAN, you can either get a LAN pass in South America or fly LAN within Chile only. The fares were extremely reasonable when I was down there, and given the stretch of land and how long it is, you can hop around within the country reasonably if you don't want to take the bus and if you're not comfortable doing that. By flight, there's a tiny airport in Calama, and then you drive about an hour and a half into San Pedro de Atacama from there.
And when you talk about the bus, it sounds like you took the first class bus option at this point. I assume that there is a second or third class bus option?
They're very reasonably priced. There's the VIP version of the bus, which I did not take, which is usually, they're double deckers. So a lot of them are double deckers. The best way of explaining it is there are 6 lazy boys in the bottom of a bus, and your feet stretch out, you get wine with your meal, and someone gives you a blanket, and those are a little more than double than the original price. The top is called a semicama, the half sleeping part, and that is what most people take. It's not just tourists. I mean, most of my buses were local people. The seats do go back considerably. They are fairly comfortable. Granted, I'm 5 feet tall, so I guess it's relative, but I was comfortable. The local buses, the type of chicken buses that you hear about in Asia, those are in Bolivia. And actually, there was a tourist bus that left Uyuni, but it was full. And we ended up taking the non-tourist bus, which really was the worst bus I've ever been on. I did a top 5 worst bus rides in Myanmar post not too long ago from my time in Burma, Myanmar, because the buses were just unbelievable. And I said to everyone at the end of it, these are the worst in Myanmar, but nothing tops the bus ride in Bolivia. So I think people visiting Chile don't have too much to be concerned about in terms of the buses. The roads are extremely well maintained. They're paved, all of them that I was on, and everything is extremely accessible. So like I said, it's a very accessible country for first-time travelers to South America.
From the resources you looked at to begin with, what do the guidebooks recommend that you really think people should skip, or vice versa? What do they miss that they really should include?
One of the things that I didn't get to do is the Lauca National Park, which is all the way up near Arica, near the border of Peru. It's a beautiful park that is really well known. It's one of the biggest parks in the country, and it's extremely protected. It's in the Andes, and I think it's close to 1,400 kilometers of land with huge volcanoes. It's got a huge biosphere reserve, so it borders the Bolivian version of that and Peru on the other side, but I never got there. And from what I've heard, that is extremely well recommended. I think one of the least favorite places that I went to was Santiago itself. I've spent a considerable time in Buenos Aires, and I really enjoyed it. But Santiago, I just never really felt both comfortable or really impressed by. It does have a higher rate of mugging than pretty much anywhere else in Chile. Not mugging in a violent way, just a lot of people got pickpocketed. And the area I stayed in the youth hostel was certainly not very comfortable for me. But otherwise, I think much of what the country has to offer is the sheer vastness and disparate nature of its landscape. And for something that is so narrow but so long as a country, it's bound to have an incredible cross-section of available places. So if people have the time, I would really recommend trying to go down to Patagonia, flying through Santiago and up to the north to get that incredible contrast between those two areas.
Okay. What was the best day you had in Chile?
I think my time trekking in Patagonia was definitely surreal and just beautiful. I think I truly loved Valparaiso, which I never really talked about. And that was, of course, hit very hard by the earthquake recently.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole town is just so colorful. It's full of funiculares and these sort of dizzying Lego-like buildings. The whole city is surrounded by shantytowns or favelas at the top of these rolling hills. And it was declared a UNESCO site in 2003. It's also Chile's cultural capital. And the joke to Chileans is that Viña del Mar is where the rich people go and Valparaiso is where the artists go. And it just really appealed to me. The city is sort of jumbled and stacked behind these hills that overlook the bay of Valparaiso. There's just so much art in the streets and just old buildings with beautiful paintings on them and these huge plants kind of growing into the walls. There's something very bohemian and beautiful about the city. And I think wandering around that day and taking pictures was one of my favorite days in the city, in the country as well, because it just was something totally different from Santiago and from everywhere else I had been in Patagonia.
And you're not very far from Santiago at that point. You're on the coast there.
That's right. Yeah, it's a very easy trip. I stayed at a lovely place. It was one of the nicest hostels I stayed at in South America. It's called La Luna Sonrisa, and it's at the very, very top of Cerro Alegre, one of the hills around the city. It had breakfast included. They made their own bread. It was just this tiny house that was sort of stacked over each other over the top of the hill, and I really found it was delightful.
And then you jumped into Spanish there briefly and said there were a lot of funiculares, so I'm assuming funiculars, trains going up the hills?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just wanted to make sure my translation there was accurate.
Yes, and they have tons of them in the city. They're old and kind of rickety, but they run around into the hills that overlook the bay.
Okay. You mentioned the pickpocketing in Santiago. Any other warnings you would give?
I think the only warning really is that if anyone is interested in seeing a football match, or as we call soccer, we went, the Copa Libertadores was on, and I'm a soccer fanatic, as you know from TVEX, when I skipped one of the lectures in order to attend a viewing of the soccer match during the World Cup. I went to see Colo Colo play in a Copa Libertadores match, and they were playing against Atlas de Mexico. And basically, it's very different than seeing any game here because the crowd is extremely rowdy. If you want to include in this program notes, I do have videos on the site of the fans basically throwing lit firecrackers at each other. One of the guys that I had met and we'd been traveling with, all of a sudden we were walking and he just fell to the ground and someone had come to grab his hand. He had the money in his hand to buy our tickets. And someone basically just grabbed him and grabbed the money, and he went down with it and actually ended up not letting it go. But I think it's just wise to keep in mind if you go see a soccer game that it's not like seeing one in North America. It is known for sort of hooliganism in a subtler way than you might think, but definitely to watch your purse.
You mentioned knowing Spanish, and that was something that served you well there. How about for those people who are not as comfortable in Spanish?
When I said it served me well, it was mostly in Bolivia that came truly in handy because almost no one did speak English there. It's a much grittier place than Chile.
Sure.
Almost everyone I met did not speak Spanish and had no problem getting by. As you said, there's a really big infrastructure for tourism in Chile, especially in Patagonia and up in San Pedro de Atacama. I think you really wouldn't have a problem. For me, what makes travel so fun and interesting is being able to find out the life stories, the people that I meet and interact with. So my cab driver trying to find out his life story or the person who runs the little stand. That's what I meant by it came in handy because I was very sad to lose that when I went into Asia because obviously I don't speak Thai or Mandarin. And so it was something that I felt was very special. But I think it's fine to get by without it. A lot of people didn't speak a word of Spanish, the basic gracias or por favor, and that was it. And I think they did just fine.
Okay. Well, it's a much more similar language, obviously, when, you can figure out what funicularis means or other words like that.
Right. It's not like Thai.
Yeah. And you talked about meeting some of the locals. Who was the most memorable local you met?
In Chile, one of the cab drivers that I did have down in Patagonia, I actually was quite sick. I had been sick when I left New York, and I think I made the mistake of working very hard and not taking time between quitting my job and leaving. I was just so excited to leave. And I started with a cold. You
mentioned working 90 hours a week and then getting on a plane.
There were 2 weeks, I think, between my last day and leaving. But when you're leaving on a round-the-world trip for an indefinite period of time, 2 weeks is not much. So I do have a Chilean versus Argentine hospital throwdown on the blog because I had the benefit of going to both hospitals in both countries. And so one of the cab drivers I had down in Punta Arenas was really worried about me being sick, and he insisted on basically driving me around during the time that I was in the city, which was very nice. He ended up also trying to get me to marry his son, but overall, he was a very interesting character. You know, he worked very hard. He invited me to his family to learn more about them, and I ate dinner with him and his wife and his son. It was just a really lovely sidetrack from being sick, and also a nice contrast to the hostels and the tourists that I met, who were very nice and interesting, but there's something to be said about really diving into the local culture as well.
Sure.
Not by getting married, but still.
Well, you said it was he rather than the son who was the most memorable, so the story would have ended differently probably if that had not been the case.
I think the one thing I would add as well is one of my first days in the country was in Punta Arenas, which is south. There is a cemetery there in the middle of town that's sort of built like La Recoleta. It has the drawers in some parts of it, and it's this old, jumbled, beautiful cemetery, and I would highly recommend anyone who's visiting Punta Arenas to go see it, because I found not only were the photos something that I look back on and smile just because of how incredible it was, but also it just is one of those places you can sit and think and really reflect on the things you've seen so far.
And you mentioned photos. Which of your photos do you look at and just you're immediately back in Chile?
I think the cemetery is definitely one of them. The Valle de la Muerte in the middle of San Pedro, or near San Pedro, the Death Valley. I had printed out business cards with pictures on one side and my information on the other. And there's one where my friends were silhouetted, there are four of them, in shadows, and in back of them, the whole valley is actually in light. And that's just one of my favorites, because that whole day of trolling around Death Valley and the Moon Valley, and that night at midnight being in the middle of the desert with that astronomer and all these people shivering and drinking hot chocolate and looking at the stars, that was one of the best days, I think, as well, that I had in the country. So that picture really brings that back for me.
What was one thing that you saw in Chile and you just had to laugh and say, only in Chile?
I really don't think there is something. That's one of the interesting things about Chile. Part of what makes it so easily digestible for first-time travelers to South America also makes it less unique in its personality.
Closer to home. Closer
to home, same way that Uruguay is continuously trying to differentiate itself from Argentina. I suppose Uruguay is the Canada of South America in the sense that its bigger brother is constantly taking all the news. But I think Chile, the one thing that differentiates it from the other countries I found was people don't seem to punctuate when they speak Spanish. It's like one big sentence, or half the word is cut off, every single word. It was definitely much harder to understand for me than most other places in the continent. And when you speak to people who've traveled to Chile and to South America as a whole, they always say, oh, Chile, I just can't understand anything anyone says. And I think it's part of the local culture. It's this very quick and cut Spanish accent that is a lot of fun, but very difficult to understand.
Now, I know when I was learning Spanish and I was watching a series of videos, they were going through different regions of the world, and Argentine Spanish, for instance, is much slower than what I'm used to in Mexico. Have you been to Mexico also to compare that to Chile? Is it as fast as the Mexicans speak Spanish?
I think it's a very different accent than Mexico. And Mexico has, of course, a lot of slang.
Sure.
I learned in Uruguay and Argentina, and so I say vos and chamame instead of llamame. So for me, getting used to Mexican Spanish was a lot harder, not just because of the speed. But there's no question that Chilean Spanish, it just seems to lump into one word. I just had a hard time. And granted, I never went to school for Spanish. I just wrote down words every night. I was living in the middle of this nature area of Uruguay and then in wetlands in Argentina. So no one spoke a word of English, and there was nowhere really to learn. It was just me and the poisonous spiders in my room trying to learn Spanish.
Sorry.
So my vocabulary is definitely lacking more than someone.
Go back a bit there.
I was working in sustainable law and in environmental protection, and I was in a place called La Barra de Maldonado, which is in Uruguay, and also in Los Estados de Iberra, which is one of the biggest wetlands in South America, working to protect the wetlands and to get those wetlands recognized as protectable. And I remember going into the wetlands, and they told me, sort of off the cuff in the car. By the way, if you see a spider and it lifts its two front legs and you glimpse some orange, I would cover your eyes and close your mouth, because if its venom gets into your mucous membranes, well, the antidote is in Buenos Aires and you just won't make it in time. And I just stopped. I had no blog at that time. Obviously, that was 2001. But all I was thinking was, these are the things I don't tell my mother until I come home. Yeah.
As we go to wind this down, anything else that people should know before they go to Chile?
I don't think it's one of those places where there's some tips to really...
Some magic thing that you had to know that before you went that no one told you.
Right. I would definitely be mindful of the fact that if you do the full W trek down in Torres del Paine, it's a very difficult trek, and to definitely do it as early in January or earlier in the year if you can. It's not to be taken lightly, but it is unbelievably beautiful. And you can do it without a guide to certain parts. But if you're not so experienced with camping in places like that, then I would definitely take a guide with you. I think, call ahead if you can in terms of hostels and the like. I got very used to not doing that in Asia and just wandering around. But there is limited lodging in some of these places in Patagonia. They are tiny towns.
Okay.
So I would definitely consider calling ahead and finding some place to stay, at least for the first night while you figure it out. And the other thing is, it's Patagonia. There is fantastic meat if you are a meat eater. Incredible lamb, some of the best lamb I've ever eaten. And so there's certainly no shortage of fantastic places to try that as you run around through the south of Chile.
Excellent. I think I've got 4 questions left.
Go ahead.
If you're in Chile, don't forget to eat the...
Oh, it's so tough. I'm so all about food. My brain was just a huge lump of amazing pictures in my head. I think definitely the lamb in Patagonia. They really are known for it. And if you're not a vegetarian, I was vegetarian before I moved to South America when I was working there. And once I tried the meat in Argentina, I kind of went, can't do it anymore. And while I tend to not eat red meat much in North America at all, seeing a cow eating grass on the side of a volcano, you kind of look at the cow and go, that's where cows are supposed to eat. And it shows when you eat them. I mean, the meat, both in Chile and in Argentina, tastes really good, the lamb. And the wine, I mean, Chile is known for its wines as well. And I would definitely consider taking one in your backpack with a screw-off top. Otherwise, bring a wine opener. And in the middle of your hike, and you're in the middle of the mountains, to really just enjoy your moment with a glass of wine as well. The one thing I would also say, back to your tips, I apologize, is that San Pedro de Atacama is quite high.
Sure.
Altitude-wise.
Sure, we forgot to talk about that.
Just to be mindful, I had been at high altitude for quite a few days at that point. One of my friends had not. It was her birthday. She had one pisco sour, and that was all. I think you have to be very careful about drinking in high altitudes if you do want to sort of try the wine, to be careful about it when you're that high up, because your body definitely cannot process it the way it would be able to at a lower altitude.
Okay. Your best money-saving tip for Chile?
I would say that there are these incredible sandwiches. They call it the completo in South America.
The complete. So they put everything in the sandwich.
Right. Everything you could possibly imagine, really. And it's this huge melting heap of something, but it tastes delicious. There's just a huge amount of food in these tiny little diners almost that you see in town. So I think the best money-saving tip is one that I really advocate in any country, which is ask your taxi driver where he eats, or ask the hotel not where they would recommend, but where they would go for dinner. So there are places that just have these greasy spoons with melt-in-your-mouth food that's extremely cheap, and I think that is the best tip. The other thing is to buy your own food and bring it on the buses if the bus doesn't have any food on it, because you'll be stopping at places where the bus gets commission to stop.
Sure.
And again, the same goes in many different countries, to just bring your own food on the bus.
Okay. And finish this sentence for me. You really know you're in Chile when what?
I would say when the Spanish you know it is no more, because not just the way that it's spoken, but there's some very stubborn renaming of things like vegetables, for example. Avocados are aguacate anywhere else in South America, but in Chile they're called palta. Corn is not maíz like it is anywhere else. It's choclo. Mushrooms are not seta, they're calampa. Beans are called poroto. There's just a very, for whatever reason, they've decided to rename a lot of the vegetables, many other things as well, but the vegetables stood out because, of course, we were trying to order food. And while people knew exactly what we were talking about, they refused to acknowledge it. So I think that was one of my memories as well. It was a very funny thing to figure out. People just looked at me like I was growing a second head, even though it was pretty obvious because they're reaching for what I asked for, that they know exactly what I meant.
And if you had to summarize Chile in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Oh, I would say otherworldly, glaciers, and really, for me, buses. The buses. So much of my time in that country was spent on a bus, just gazing out at the beautiful landscapes. And if people have the time, I think that's something they should do as well.
Excellent. Well, Jodi, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to have you. And I definitely would recommend checking out Jodi's blog at legalnomads.com. And especially, I would say probably some of the writings she did about Thailand, where she was in and amongst the riots that were going on there earlier this year. So
thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for having me.
I'm trying to get this show out tonight before I take off for a rafting trip on the Green River in Colorado tomorrow. So I'm under a little bit of time pressure, so I'm probably not going to do community news, but we'll resume that next week. I did want to point out 2 travel resources for you. I know I haven't done that recently, but they are the 2 things that I'll be working on as my initial projects at TripAdvisor. So I thought maybe you'd want to check them out. One is seatguru.com, and SeatGuru is a great site. If you don't know about it, I mean, I'm thrilled to be working on it. But basically, if you're booking an airline seat, if you're choosing a seat for a particular flight, it will tell you which seats are good, which seats are bad, which ones have power plugs, that sort of thing. So great site. And then the other one is a site that I'm actually less familiar with, and that's a newer site, which is TripAdvisor Flights, and that is a meta search engine to search for flights. So I'm very excited about working on that. That's tripadvisor.com/flights. With that, I think we'll draw this show to a close, and again, we'll start back with regular community news next week. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com or catch me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.